86% of the people caught up in the new limits on superannuation borrowing are not property tycoons. They are nurses, tradies, and teachers who hold exactly one investment property inside their self-managed super fund, and from the middle of this year, the rules around how they can use that money changed for good. If you are somewhere between 55 and 65, you have probably been told your super is your safety net. But a shift in the rules governing limited recourse borrowing arrangements has quietly created what I am going to call a $31,223 a year trap, and most people will not notice it until they are already living inside it. The government is calling this a crackdown on the wealthy. The numbers say something different. When everyday Australians lose the ability to borrow inside their fund to buy a single residential property, it does not just change SMSF strategy. It changes how many new apartments get built, which changes how much you or your kids pay in rent, and it changes how many people end up leaning on the age pension, which tops out at $1,200.90 a fortnight for a single person. So even if you have never touched an SMSF and everything you own sits in a standard industry fund, this affects you. Over the next few minutes, I want to show you the part of this policy nobody is talking about, and the number that shows why sitting safely in a balanced fund might still leave you thousands short every year. Start with the ATO's own numbers. 86% of SMSF members who hold residential property own precisely one, not a portfolio, not 10 investment units. That single fact tells you who this policy actually touches. And it is not the property mogul the headlines describe. I have watched people wave this off in the pub because they do not run an SMSF themselves. You might be thinking the same thing right now, that this is somebody else's problem. But you cannot step outside the economics of it just because your money sits in an industry fund instead. The mechanism works like this. A developer in Australia usually needs somewhere between 60% and 80% of a new apartment block sold off the plan before a bank will release construction finance. SMSF buyers, using borrowing arrangements to buy that one investment unit, have made up a meaningful slice of those early sales for years. Take that buyer out of the market, and pre-sales slow down. When pre-sales slow down, fewer projects hit the threshold that lets them break ground. When fewer projects break ground, the supply of new rental stock stalls in the years that follow. And when supply stalls, rent goes up for everyone chasing what is left, including retirees who are planning to sell the family home and downsize into something smaller and easier to manage. That is the invisible cost of this policy. It does not show up as a line item anywhere. It shows up a few years from now as a higher number on a lease renewal, the kind of jump that lands next to your electricity bill, and your council rates notice in the same tight budget. And by then, almost nobody connects it back to a borrowing rule that changed in 2026. This is where it turns personal. The As for Retirement standard for 2026 puts a comfortable single lifestyle at around $54,840 a year. The maximum age pension for a single person comes in at $31,223 a year. Sit those two numbers side by side, and you get a gap of $23,617 every single year, money that has to come from somewhere else. A couple aiming for that same comfortable standard needs a lump sum of roughly $690,000 saved by the time they retire, according to the same ASFA figures. Reducing the tools available to build that lump sum does not close the gap. It widens it. Think about what that means if you are still 5 or 10 years out from retiring. Every year that gap sits open. The lump sum you need to close it keeps growing too, because ASFA updates its comfortable figure most quarters to track the real cost of living, not a number frozen in time. But there is one door the government left wide open, a type of property they never touched the borrowing rules for, and it might be the most useful workaround for anyone who still wants property inside their fund. Section 67A of the Superannuation Industry Supervision Act still lets a fund borrow money to buy business real property. Warehouses, offices, and industrial units are untouched by the residential changes. That is the door that stayed open while the other one closed. Picture a 58-year-old who runs a small business, a plumbing supply store, a physio clinic, anything with a physical premises. Instead of paying rent to a landlord every month, that business owner can use their SMSF to buy the building outright and pay rent to their own fund instead. The rent still leaves their pocket, but now it lands inside their retirement savings rather than someone else's. I used to steer people away from commercial property inside super. The compliance is heavier, the vacancy risk is real, and it is not a set and forget strategy. But with residential borrowing being squeezed out, I have changed my view. The tax treatment on that rental income, taxed at 15% while the fund is in accumulation phase, and often at 0% once it moves into pension phase, is hard to ignore now that one of the alternatives has been closed off. The trap that catches people out looks like this. Many SMSF trust deeds written before 2015 were never updated to explicitly permit the kind of limited recourse borrowing arrangement that commercial property requires. If your deed still uses that older generic wording, the ATO can treat the entire borrowing arrangement as invalid, which unwinds the purchase and creates a tax mess nobody wants to deal with in their 60s. Run the numbers on a typical example. A $500,000 commercial suite renting at a 6% yield brings in $30,000 a year, taxed far more lightly than almost anything sitting outside super. Compare that to the 3.25% upper deeming rate the government now uses to estimate how much your savings are earning when it works out your pension eligibility. The gap between what your money can actually earn and what Centrelink assumes it earns is the trade-off most people never see coming until their part pension shrinks for reasons that have nothing to do with their real income. None of this makes commercial property risk-free. Vacancies happen, tenants leave, and a single-tenant building can sit empty for months while the loan repayments keep landing. It simply shifts the risk to one you can inspect and manage yourself instead of one decided in Canberra. If your plan is to simply wait this out and lean on the age pension later, you need to see what that deeming step-up is doing to the size of your fortnightly payment right now. Between 2020 and 2025, the government froze the deeming rates used to test pension eligibility at 0.25% and 2.25%. That freeze made it easier for a lot of retirees to qualify for a full or part pension because Centrelink assumed your savings were earning next to nothing. That era is over. As of March 2026, the upper deeming rate sits at 3.25%, more than 14 times where it was during the freeze. Centrelink now assumes your financial assets are earning considerably more than they were assumed to earn 2 years ago. And that assumption is what determines how much of your pension gets clawed back under the income test. It is worth sitting with that for a second. The government is not only making it harder to build new wealth through the borrowing changes, it is also raising the bar on how much it assumes you already have, using a rate that has nothing to do with what your bank account or term deposit is actually paying you. Say you hold $200,000 in savings and shares outside your home. Under the new upper rate, Centrelink assumes a bigger slice of that pot is generating income, and that assumed income counts against your pension dollar for dollar once you cross the relevant threshold. Even in a year, your investments barely moved at all. Picture two retirees at 67. One owns a paid-off commercial property inside their SMSF, collecting rental income that moves roughly in line with inflation each year through the lease. The other has no property, relies on a balanced industry fund, and tops that up with a part pension. The first retiree's income barely moves when Canberra hands down a budget. The second retiree's fortnightly payment can shift every time deeming rates or thresholds get updated because their whole position is priced off assumptions somebody else controls. If you are a mum and dad investor, and it feels like the goalposts just moved 20 meters back on you, you are not imagining it. Subscribe and stay with me, because we track these legislative shifts as they land, so you are not the last to know when the next one hits. There are really only two ways to head into your late 60s from here. Call them the fragile path and the resilient one. The fragile path looks fine on paper. Your employer has been paying the super guarantee at 12% for a while now. Your balance keeps ticking up on your statement, and it is sitting in whatever balanced option your industry fund defaulted you into. It feels like enough. But a balanced return that is mostly shares and bonds does not automatically outrun inflation. And the kind of rent and aged care cost increases we just talked about, and there is nothing in that fragile path that protects you from a policy change the government makes on budget night. The resilient path means putting money into things a single announcement cannot easily undo. One straightforward way to do that is using the new concessional contributions cap for the 2026 to 2027 financial year, which sits at $32,500 to push more into super before your balance gets anywhere near the $3 million threshold, where the Division 296 tax starts applying an extra layer of tax on your fund's earnings. The opportunity cost here is bigger than most people realize. If your total super balance is under $500,000, you can carry forward any unused concessional cap for up to 5 years. Skip that window, and you permanently lose the chance to shield those contributions from your top marginal tax rate, which for a lot of people heading into this decade sits at 45%. That is not a small rounding error. It is real money handed to the tax office instead of your own retirement. It is worth being honest about the trade-off here too. Locking more money into super means locking it away until you reach preservation age. So this only works if you already have enough sitting outside super to comfortably get you through the years before you can touch it. So what happens if the share market drops the same year you are meant to retire? We need to run that stress test now, because the answer changes everything about which path you should be on. Imagine the ASX 200 drops 15% right as you move from working life into pension phase. Not a crash exactly, just an ordinary correction, the kind that happens every few years. For someone with their entire balance sitting in a high growth option, that timing is brutal. To fund a lifestyle costing around $1,200 a fortnight, they have no choice but to sell units while the market is down, locking in a loss that a working age person with decades ahead of them would simply ride out. This is what is known as sequence of returns risk, and it does not care how disciplined you were for the previous 30 years. It only cares what your balance looks like on the day you need to draw from it. A market that recovers within 18 months does the unprepared retiree no good at all, because the units they were forced to sell during the dip are gone, along with any recovery those units would have delivered. Now picture someone who built a cash buffer or holds a commercial property inside their fund, partly funded through the $130,000 non-concessional contributions cap in the years before retiring. Their rent or their cash reserve covers the bills that quarter. They do not need to touch their shares at all, which gives those shares time to recover before the money is ever withdrawn. There is another number worth knowing here. From July 2026, the transfer balance cap sits at $2.1 million, the amount you can move into the tax-free pension phase, where earnings are not taxed at all. Structuring your fund to make full use of that cap is one of the clearest ways to protect a chunk of your savings from exactly this kind of shock. None of this is really about the maths, though. It is about the paralysis that stops most people from ever making the change, even once they understand it. There is a name for what stops most people from acting on any of this. Psychologists call it status quo bias, and in plain language, it just means doing nothing feels safer than doing something, even when doing nothing is quietly costing you money. It is completely normal to feel like the system is a bit rigged against you here. When 86% of the people affected by these borrowing changes are ordinary mum and dad savers with one property, and some of the coverage still frames them as greedy investors, of course the instinct is to keep your head down and stay quiet about it. The shift that actually helps is a small one. Stop thinking of your super as a savings account that just sits there, earning whatever it earns. Start thinking of it the way a business owner thinks about their own money, actively deciding where it goes and why, rather than leaving every decision to a default setting somebody chose for you years ago. You do not need millions in the bank to start making decisions that way. You just need to start making them. That might mean reviewing your investment mix once a year instead of never, or actually asking your fund what it is doing with your money instead of assuming it is fine. Small, ordinary decisions, repeated, are what running your own family office really looks like. I do not have a crystal ball here. I cannot tell you whether Canberra makes another change to this next year or the year after. What I can tell you, from watching a lot of people go through this stage of life, is that the ones who end up holding something real, a property, a paid-down asset, a clear plan, tend to fare better than the ones who are only holding promises about what the system will still look like when they need it. Start with an audit. Log into your super account and find your actual total balance, not the number you remember from a few years ago. If it comes in under $500,000, look up how much unused concessional cap you have carried forward from previous years, because that figure disappears if you never use it. And once a financial year closes, there is no getting it back. If a residential property purchase inside your SMSF was part of your original plan, this is the moment to have a proper conversation with a specialist about the commercial or industrial alternative instead, before you assume the whole idea is off the table. Then max out what you can. The concessional contributions cap for the 2026 to 2027 financial year is $32,500, and salary sacrificing even $200 a fortnight chips away at your taxable income while working toward that gap between the age pension and a genuinely comfortable retirement. Here is what that actually looks like in practice. Salary sacrificing $200 a fortnight works out to $5,200 a year, taxed at 15% inside super instead of your normal marginal rate. For someone sitting on the 32.5% tax bracket, that difference is a real saving for redirecting money you were already planning to put aside. Set a date each year, tied to whenever your fund statement lands, to run back through these 3 steps. Caps change, thresholds change, and whatever setup made sense last year will not necessarily make sense next year. None of this fixes everything overnight, but it moves you from reacting to whatever changes next toward actually shaping your own position, which is the whole point. There is one more piece of this puzzle, something about the age pension assets test that could end up protecting the roof over your head, and it is worth understanding before we wrap this up. Strip away the politics, and this comes down to supply. Fewer SMSF buyers able to borrow for residential property means fewer projects get built, which means higher rent for everyone downstream of that decision, including people who never touch an SMSF in their life. That is the real shape of this policy, whatever it gets called, in the headlines. None of what we covered today needed a crystal ball or a finance degree. It needed knowing which levers still exist and using them before the next budget quietly closes another one. But you are not stuck with it. The commercial property pathway is still open under Section 67A. The concessional cap just moved up to $32,500. And understanding how deeming and the transfer balance cap actually work, gives you real levers to pull instead of just absorbing whatever changes next. You have put in decades of work to get to this point. Do not let a policy nobody explained properly be the thing that quietly sets the terms for your last stretch before retirement. If you want to stay ahead of changes like this one instead of finding out about them after the fact, subscribe to Aussie Retirement with Bob. We will keep tracking this together.